So different questions that you can do. What is your ethnic background? What locality did you grow up in? And what are other ethnic groups that resided in your community? How did your family see itself as similar or different from other ethnic groups? How did your family see itself or alike or different from families within your ethnic group? What are your early images of color as an ethnic factor? What are your feelings about ethnic identity? And then thinking about sort of yourself, what is it like to begin to sort of think about those questions? Those are all ways to begin to sort of cultivate that sort of sense of self-awareness here. And then just a couple of different books here. Questions? Yeah.
So I have 3 questions.
Great.
Two that are like really quick, and then one that's a little bit more in depth. So I'm Jesse Smith from Texas Tech.
Hi.
Thank you very much. That was a really great presentation.
Thank you, thank you.
And I had to like write questions down. So my first question is, towards the beginning, you quoted a statistic about marriageable men, and I just was kind of confused by the definition
Meaning,
of that.
so through the lens of from an education and occupation perspective. So the idea that if someone, within African Americans, if the man has an education and has a job, that they tend to be more marriageable in that way versus someone who is unemployed or he only has doesn't have a high school degree or things along those lines. And so looking at it through that demographic lens.
Okay, so it's kind of operationalized that way. And then my other question was about the idea of the privilege to live in a world of intentionality. So did you, I really love that a lot, and I don't know if you came up with that or if you know the source of that.
No, I don't remember for sure where. Oftentimes different ideas and things come to me when I'm also in session and working through things with a couple or what have you, sometimes through readings. I'm not quite, to be honest, sure where that, I'm sure I'm not the only person who's thought about that. I think I know that because I've heard of other folks who are focusing on that language. That's part of what constrains sometimes the conversation. And I've actually even seen this actually in the media, to be honest, when you're talking about with politics and things along those lines, that the idea of those who are in privilege, are focusing on intentionality, and those who are not, focused on consequences. Turn on CNN and begin, if you just think about that part, you'll sometimes see it through that lens. It becomes very clear where the disconnect is when people are beginning to sort of talk through it. And when you're working with couples, at least for me as well, whenever I bring that up to couples, also, and sometimes it can be a light bulb moment for some. And it can begin to be a way to sort of say, okay, how can I now be a lot more humble and curious, and realizing that that's the bias that I'm bringing to this, and being able to be mindful of the privilege that perhaps they weren't aware of.
Yeah, it really spoke to me. It was like a truth moment for me. I was like, wow, that's a really succinct and good way to put that. And then, so my third question is, you talked a lot about gender and like differences in like kind of statistical, like what happens with gender. But I'm really interested in like how gender intersects with race. And so I was, as you were presenting, particularly about working with African American couples, I was thinking a lot about that intersection. And as you were giving like examples, it seemed like there was a lot of the issues were centered around gender issues as well. Like with the example that you gave of the couple where the male was not working, and there was a lot of conflict there that was based on like gender roles. And so one thing that I always kind of struggle with is being a white male and having a lot of privilege in working with that intersectionality of, okay, if I'm working with a white couple and that's going on, I'm going to dive right into that and like work with the male. But when there's a cultural piece or a racial piece, how to balance, I'll struggle with how to balance that. And I like, the example of the not knowing stance and I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that and how to approach that balance.
Absolutely. So I would frame it even broader than that. So this idea of how do you embrace curiosity, and that curiosity really becomes the way of connecting with people who are different from you. I mean, so if I'm working with a couple and the female partner has been raped, and what that's like, and being as a man, that I'm going to look at that through a different lens. And so I need to be able to sort of, how do I engage with her to talk about it through a lens of curiosity? It's being able to, be authentic through it, and to sometimes even, put that out there, to sort of think out loud and sort of talk out loud with them. That I'm not sure that, I've been wondering about this. I wonder what this is like here as a white male, and now they're beginning to sort of enter into this dialogue. I want to be sensitive and be aware. And so, what is it, open up that conversation, so that you can begin to sort of be, the more that you can then look for a way to be, I think actually being self-disclosure in that way can be quite helpful in being able to think a lot, because it's now putting you in a one-down situation, which can then be helpful in being able to balance, I think, that alliance and being able to sort of allow yourself to be a little bit more vulnerable. I'm not quite sure here what this might be like. Is a way of being vulnerable that models it, that oftentimes I think people will then be respectful of. And so I think it's a way, at least one strategy for being able to work with that. And to also, and the curiosity definitely means that by definition you don't know what the answer is. You're curious about it, so don't presume, right? So you're also, it may not be an issue for that particular couple with it, and so you want to be able to sort of have that not knowing stance. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your presentation. This isn't my area of research, but I'm the outcome of an interracial marriage, so from that lens, it was very interesting for me, and a lot of it rang true, particularly the pieces about parents not knowing, like their kid having a unique experience, and so like I found that my parents, that wasn't really on their radar until a couple years ago. I brought it up with my mom and dad, and we talked through it a little bit, but I can imagine working with parents that it can be hard for them to get there, and it can make them feel disconnected from their kids, and they just don't get it. And it's like it's hard for them to believe, and so how do you work through that with parents when like it's hard for them to even get there?
I think I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think one of the most important parts is that the therapist, even asking that question, because I can't tell you the number of times parents have not thought about that question. And when I then ask them that question, it begins to then, they don't have a quick, there's not a quick answer to it, all right? I mean, so part of it is about being able to create, a tone in the therapy room that really invites that sort of reflection and fosters that sense of communication and connection. And by being able to bring it up and helping them to sort of think through it, giving that as even sometimes, homework assignments for them that I've done around sort of facilitate, what are some of your thoughts? What are your fears about it? What's scary about it? What's hopeful about it? What are your ideas about it? To be able to make that sort of, hidden now, transparent. Sometimes they just haven't really thought through it. So I think it's about the process as much as the outcome, to be honest. That's about the process of them beginning to sort of think through it and to talk through it and having that kind of, conversation to then figure out what's going to work for them. And so then as a therapist, my job is to try to help them perhaps be a little bit more nuanced about that, and being able to sort of figure out different situations or contexts where this might come out, but helping them with that, I think, is really the most important part of that.
And then do you ever bring in the kids into the therapy session and help kind of facilitate some of that conversation ever, or?
I've done that a couple of times, not oftentimes, not a lot, for sometimes just pragmatics, constraints. But I, again, as I mentioned before, I always like to be able to have this conversation through the lens too of, let me see what your kids look like, because how they look is actually going to be important for how does the world and society perceive them, right? There are interracial, kids who grew up who just, they look white, and it's not necessarily, you wouldn't know by looking at them, and others where they like, oh my gosh, I can know that you had a white parent at all, for instance. And so being able to just sort of understand that as a therapist can then be helpful in being able to facilitate that kind of conversation. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ashley Frazier. I'm at the University of Iowa. I really liked your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
It spoke to my research, which is the absent African-American father. What happens?
You said African-American fathers?
Absent.
Absent, mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what happens when that father is absent, especially if it's an interracial relationship or the biracial child? So how do they develop their identity?
Yep.
And then how does the African-American father become absent in the first place, society, post-traumatic slave disorder, all that. So it really spoke to everything that I'm really trying to do. And then as I just opened my private practice, trying to figure out what type of specialties I want, which is interracial couples. So, yeah.
Oh, good. No, father, actually, when I was in grad school, my dissertation work was actually on fathers and working with low-income fathers, and both from a community development. We had developed a community intervention for working with low-income fathers, and then also for anyone who's seen the Fragile Families database. My advisor mentor was one of the key people who was working on that project, and so I was able to use that for my dissertation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the data set I actually was presenting on Saturday. So.
Oh, nice, yeah, great. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Chambers. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
As well. Two things. What you mentioned, Jesse, about the intentionality versus consequences. I feel like I've heard Dr. Ken Hardy talk about that
I'm sure
a little bit.
I would not have some. Be shocked if he hadn't.
But I never thought about it in a couple contexts. So that really resonated with me as well. But the other piece that I keep thinking about is what you mentioned about just relationship satisfaction and the differences between the white male and minority woman and the minority male and the white woman. And so anecdotally, I feel like I've just heard like stories or experiences from other people that I know about like just social acceptance with black women dating outside of our race versus black men dating outside of our race. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more, and maybe if you know a little bit more about what the research says about that piece, and if that comes up in the therapy room between those partners, if the black men experience more stress or more discrimination than black women do dating outside of their race.
So I'm not aware of any research that's looked at that. To be perfectly honest, within my practice even, I've seen it play out with both, whether it's sort of minority male or minority female was a majority partner. The issues to me, so it's an interesting stat that's sort of with it, but I actually find that I've seen it, in both ways, and so and it comes out differently. So, for instance, there's a couple I can think of where he's African American and she's white, and that became for him one of the pieces that he held on to. He felt like that his wife could not understand what is it like to be a black man in this country, and to get in a car and to not know if the police is going to be, harassing you or things along those lines. What was interesting in that case, for instance, though, is that as I began to work with them and to sort of help them to have a deeper conversation, for him it actually was, it was partly that, but it was more than just that. It was the fact that he had never been, he had a hard time connecting with his own parents, his own family of origin, and he never really felt heard. And so he feels like he sort of grew up feeling that people will never understand him. And so that became sort of the easy way, so to speak, to be able to sort of, for him to talk about it. But it was actually bigger and broader than that. And so sometimes it is about being able to, in the therapy room, to just begin to look for those nuances, to look for, to try to make meaning out of something that that may say something in passing, and then you follow up on it, you realize there's actually a lot there. And so I think it's, as much as anything, being able to help the couples to connect. I mean, one of the things I'm always, I talked about the central task of marriages and management of differences. I do think one of the important goals of any intimate relationship is about connection. And how do you foster that kind of connection? What are the things that constrain a couple from connection? And the more that you can be able to understand those constraints and being able to help them to remove those constraints so they can be able to have a sense of an us and a closeness, the better that the relationship is going to be. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. I appreciate all your attention. And I know it's late here in the afternoon, and so you guys are still awake, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.